Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Great to be here at Open Book with all of you. We have one in-person student with us, Elliot Figman, who says Shabbat Shalom to everybody as well. So this morning's Parsha is Parshat Tzav, and we will get into the themes that I'm presenting today in a couple of minutes, but let's start with the blessing over Torah study. Okay, Aluma, would you like to recite the blessing today? Are you? People can unmute themselves.
Okay, there we go. Could I do it in the feminized version?
You can do it however you would like to do it. How you are called to do it at this moment.
At this moment, Brucha ad Shechina Eloteinu Ruach HaOlam Asher Kiddushatnu b'mitzvoteha v'tzivatnu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen, amen. Blessed is the source of the universe who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us to engage in your sacred wisdom, which actually is the perfect opening for today because we're going to be talking about mitzvot and mitzvah and being commanded and who is commanded and what that means. So I'm just going to share my screen and dive in. If you see my screen, nod your head. I see nods. Excellent. Thank you so much. Oops, something just happened. It just happened. Let's try this again. Okay. Okay, it should be back. Yeah? Okay, good. All right, so this week, actually yesterday, was the 100th anniversary of the Bat Mitzvah. And, you know, that word mitzvah is so interesting and so interesting in contemporary times. It's taken all kinds of meanings on. But Bat Mitzvah is literally the daughter of an obligation. So historically, and we'll see this in the Mishnah, women were not obligated by time-bound mitzvot. They were only obligated by mitzvot that were not time-bound, which is a whole conversation and complexity that we're not going to get into today. But so, for instance, from time-bound regular tefillah prayer, they are historically and classically not bound by that mitzvah, and also by tefillin and by talit, by the phylacteries we put on in the morning, and the talit, the prayer shawl that Jews wear to pray. Depending on which community we're in, men wear talitot and women do not. At Romemu and other egalitarian and liberal synagogues across the world, they do. So I want to consider today especially because the Parsha begins with the concept of tzav, or command, which we'll see in a few minutes. What does mitzvah really mean? And what does it mean to us that we're obligated? And how do we approach obligation? Do we see it as constraint or opportunity or freedom or love or all of the above? And when do we see obligation as one of those things and not the others? So those are my questions for today. And I'm going to start with two lines of a beautiful poem by Yehuda Amichai that my friend Sharon Cohn-Anisfeld and Chavruta introduced me to. He writes, and Yehuda Amichai was Israel's sort of national poet, and he died, I think, in the year 2000, but you have the chat open, you can correct me, you can add more information, you can create, another layer of text in this session, which is how I see the chat, but I unfortunately miss most of that text. Okay, but the greatest desire of all is to be in the dream of another, to feel a light pull like reins, to feel a heavy pull like chains. So one way of understanding obligation, the broadest term, or mitzvah, a narrower term, is to think about how we are pulled. Like there's no day that I don't wake up and say, oh my God, what do I have to do today? Like what do I have to, like I'm always, and I think to be human is to be pulled, to be obligated, to be compelled. What do I have to do today? Or what does this mean about what I have to do? Like there are all kinds of ways that we think about what we have to do. And I just think this image is so beautiful, right? The greatest desire of all is to be in the dream of another, right? And what does that mean? Sharon and I were discussing, what that means. Like, what kind of effect do I have on another? Do I appear in the dreams of another? And then what does it mean for them to feel my pull? And what does it mean for me to feel their pull? And, some people, we say about them that they have a commanding presence, right? Think about that. Like, what does that mean? A commanding presence. I've been in some people's orbit where I felt literally, I couldn't extricate myself, even though I really had to go, like I had something to do. But it was just like, the presence was so commanding, I couldn't go. So I think about that a lot, like who has claims on, who am I claimed by? Okay, so that's the broad picture, and just this historical note about girls becoming bat mitzvah, becoming daughters of mitzvah, or considered obligated in Judaism. And I myself did not have a bat mitzvah in the Syrian Jewish community. Girls were not at all considered obligated, and in fact, I didn't go to synagogue growing up, except for on Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, at which time I was sitting in the back, and women didn't even really open up a prayer book in my community. That's not true for all Orthodox communities at all, and it's actually changed in the Syrian Jewish community as well. Girls are much more involved in prayer, although the synagogues are not, do not even approach egalitarianism in any kind of way. But they do now consider prayer a serious activity for girls, but not an obligation. Okay, so here we have Judith Kaplan, the daughter of Mordechai Kaplan, who is, the great thinker and founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. He started off as a conservative rabbi and then founded Reconstructionism. And there's been all kinds of great celebrations in the past week. So here, coupled with that, is the historical Mishnah, and the Mishnah is a 2nd century document, or at least written down in 2nd century and was oral for generations before that. And this represents a common trope in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, like who's obligated and who's not. And here we're talking specifically about appearing in Jerusalem for the 3 pilgrim festivals. So that's on Sukkot, Shavuot. I'm missing one. Pesach, of course. How could I forget Pesach, which is coming up? So Sukkot and then Pesach and Shavuot. So Wendy Miles is here and has just filled me in. Thank you, Wendy. Okay, so I'm going to read this in Hebrew and then in English. Hakol chayavin b'ri'iyah. So everybody's obligated to be seen, right, on these 3 pilgrim festivals in Jerusalem at the temple. Chutz mecheresh shoteh v'katan, except for a deaf mute. Okay, trigger warning here, just trigger warning. This is offensive and it's demeaning and it's upsetting. So I just want to say that. Except for a deaf mute and imbecile and a minor. So the minor is not so upsetting. It's like, okay, a child, doesn't get a driver's license or isn't qualified to drink until a certain age. That I don't find so offensive, but the rest of it is really disturbing. And this is interesting because, okay, v'timtum v'androgynos. So those who are of uncertain, gender, sexual categories. And that's interesting because even in ancient Judaism, they were aware that not everyone fit into 2 gender categories. So that I find fascinating. And a friend of mine wrote her dissertation about it, and I think it was published as a book if anyone's interested. V'nashim, and women, v'avadim, she'enam mishuchrarim, who are not slaves who are not freed. The hachiger v'hasomeh, and the lame and the blind. So now, and Sharon and I were discussing this a little bit and slightly disagreeing about this next category that I feel like these examples bring us to. Hacholeh, the one who's sick, and the elderly person, hazaken, umi she'eno yachol la'alot biraglav. So the sick, the elderly, and one who cannot come up with their legs. So it's interesting that this is not, so at first glance, I felt like, this is like compassionate, right? They can't make their way to Jerusalem, but somehow it also overlaps with the category of a lame. So it's a little confusing. So that's what you have before you. Possible 3 categories in this list: one who's not of age, those who are not of status, and the third, one who cannot manage to go to Jerusalem. Okay, so now this brings us to Tzav, which is the beginning of our Parsha. And the Parsha is all about the priest's sacrifices and clothing and kind of the launching of the newly built Mishkan. Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, and God spoke to Moses saying, Tzav et Aharon ve'et banav lemor zot Torat ha'olah, hi ha'olah al mokda al hamazbeach, Kol halayla ad haboker ve'esh hamizbeach tukad bo. Okay, I just wanted. Do you have sources? Sources? Okay, good, excellent. Okay. So God spoke to Moses, saying, "Command Aaron and his sons thus: This is the ritual of the burnt offering. The burnt offering itself shall remain where it is, burned upon the altar all night until morning, while the fire on the altar is kept going on it." So in terms of the burning and the ashes, Rabbi Ingrid spoke about that last night, but today I just want to talk about tzav. So tzav here, the word which is like at the root of the word mitzvah, command, is here in command form. So God tells Moses to command Aaron and his sons. Which is perhaps in tension, and again, my friend Sharon brought that up this morning, in tension with the next parsha, where 2 of Aaron's sons don't follow the command as instructed and are actually taken by God through fire. So here Moses is instructed to tell Aaron, or is instructed to command Aaron. So Moses becomes the commander. Okay, so now I want to investigate a little bit, and everybody, we're on source 5, everybody in the room. Investigate a little bit some presentations of what command means in the Torah. So here we are, the classic example of being commanded. The people are standing at Sinai in Exodus 19, and I'll read that. Vayotze Moshe et ha'am l'krat Elohim min ha'machaneh vayitzvu b'tachtit ha'har. So again, Sinai, the 10 Commandments are heard, the 10 Commandments, which are seen later as 10, are heard in Exodus 20. Now we're in Exodus 19, and there's all kind of complicated approaches to Sinai and Moses going up and down the mountain. And here it says Moses led the people out of the camp toward God, and they took their place at the foot of the mountain. B'tachtit ha'har. So literally, and you'll see what the rabbis are going to do with this literalness in a minute, they are underneath the mountain. Okay, so I want you to have the context. I'm not going to read the rest of this specific paragraph. I'm going to go to the next piece, which is another sort of response, or sort of lays the groundwork for how the people respond to command. Vayikach Sefer HaBrit. So this is after they hear the 10 Commandments or God's voice directly. And if you remember, and I've talked about this before, because I find this a very compelling moment, right after the Israelites hear God's voice directly, they say to Moses, "Don't let God speak to us anymore directly unless, or we'll die. You speak to us." And for the rest of the Torah, they don't hear God's voice directly, right? So God communicates with Moshe, and Moses communicates to the people. So here in Exodus 24, that is exactly what's happening. Moshe is communicating with the people. Vayikach sefer habrit vayikra beoznei ha'am. So Moses takes the record of the covenant and reads it out loud to the people, and literally in the ears of the people. Right? There's a lot about how they can listen and how they can't listen. Vayamru kol, and what do they say? Vayamru kol asher diber Adonai na'aseh v'nishma. And they say everything that God says, we will do and we will hear. We will do and we will listen. Or we will do and we will understand. So it's an interesting order. I'm going to leave the rest of it behind. I just wanted to show you their willingness in this moment. Okay, so now I want to jump to Esther, in the book of Esther, which is definitely one of my favorite narratives in the entire Bible, despite how disturbing it is in places. For another understanding of command, how command is generated and how the people take on command. And we'll see in a minute how the Talmud brings these texts together. Okay, so this is towards the end of the book of Esther. The book of Esther has 10 chapters, and this is the 9th. And here we're in the aftermath of the war, and we're moving into kind of the codification of Purim. And I think it's the only holiday in the Bible itself, not totally sure this is true, which is humanly generated. Maybe Tisha B'Av is as well, but anyway, people discuss in the chat. It needs to be corrected, okay, or filled in. Okay. So here's what happened. Ki amim asher nachu bahem hayudim me oivehem v'hachodesh asher nehapach lahem miyagon l'simcha me'evel liyom tov la'asot otam yemei mishteh v'simcha u'mishloch manot ish l're'ehu u'matanot la'evyonim. The same days on which the Jews enjoyed relief from their foes in the same month which had been transformed for them from one of grief and mourning to one of festive joy. They were to observe, so this is, here's how the experience becomes a commemoration, them as days of feasting and merrymaking and as an occasion for sending gifts. So these are the mitzvot of Purim, sending gifts to one another and also giving presents to the poor. So gifts to your friends and some kind of, offerings to the poor. Okay, so now in 23, Vakibel hayudim et asher hechelu la'asot ve'et asher katav Mordechai alehem. The Jews accordingly assumed as an obligation that which they had begun to practice and which Mordechai prescribed for them. So they took it upon themselves. I'm going to skip the part about Haman, and then in verse 25. Ubevo'a lifnei hamelach amar im hasefer yashuv mechashavto hara'ah asher chashav al yudim al rosho v'talu otov et banav al ha'etz. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded with the promulgation of this decree, let the evil plot which he devised against the Jew recoil on his own head. So he impaled him and his sons on the stake. Al ken kar'u liyamim ha'elet purim al shem hapur al ken al kol divrei ha'igeret hazot umara'u al kacha umahigia alehem. For that reason, these days were named Purim after Pur, in view then of all the instructions in the said letter of what they had experienced in that matter and what had befallen them. So that's the letters that Esther and Mordechai wrote. Okay, so here's the crux. Kiyamu v'kiblu hayudim alehem v'al zar'am al kol hanilvim alehem v'lo ya'avor liyot osim et shnei hayamim ha'ela kichitavam ukizmanam b'chol shana v'shana. The Jews undertook and irrevocably obligated themselves and their descendants and all who might join them to observe these days in the manner prescribed and at the proper time each year. Okay, so consequently, so this is like, again, the Jews are actively taking this upon themselves and obligating themselves, which is very different than what happened at Sinai. You can feel that. The hayamim ha'ela nizkarim v'na'asim b'chol dor v'dor mishpacha u'mishpacha medina u'medina ir v'ir v'yemei ha'purim ha'ela lo ya'avru mitoch ha'yudim v'zichram lo yasuf mizar'am. Consequently, these days are recalled and observed in every generation by every family, every province, every city, and these days of Purim shall never cease among the Jews, and they haven't yet, right? And the memory of them shall never perish among their descendants. ותכתוב אסתר המלכה בת אביחיל ומרדכי היהודי את כל תוקף לקיים את איגרת הפורים הזאת השנית. So finally, then Queen Esther, daughter of Avichail, wrote a second letter of Purim, because everything in Purim has twos, for the purpose of confirming with full authority the aforementioned one of Mordechai the Jew. So he wrote the first letter and she wrote the second letter, and I love this association of full authority with Esther, right? So not only is this book where there's a human-generated command, but it's also a female-generated command, or at least in part a female-generated command. Okay, so then, Jay, I see your hand, but I just want to get through the Gemara, and then I will take comments. Okay, so let's see what the Talmud says about these set of texts, or at least Sinai versus Esther. Okay, and they stood at the bottom of the mountain, as we just saw. Vayityatzvu b'tachtit hahar. Okay, Rabbi Avdimi, the son of Chama, the son of Chasa, said, this teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, held the mountain over them like a barrel. So, shekafa hakadosh baruch hu alem et har kigigit, and said, if you accept the Torah, it is good, and if not, here shall be your graves. V'amar lahem im atem mekablim haTorah mutav v'im lav sham tehei kavuratchem. Okay, so that's kind of disturbing, right? That's not a free association, a free approach to obligation. It is complete force, right? And in Judaism, any contract that is forced is not considered binding. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said, from here there is a great claim against the Torah because of what I just said. And Rav said, even so. So what happened? They accepted again willingly in the days of Chashverosh, as it is written. They upheld and accepted the text that we just read. Kimu v'kiblu ayudim kimu mashi kiblu kvar. They upheld what they already accepted. In other words, what they're saying here is that they upheld now, I think what this is saying is, what they upheld now, what they accepted earlier, but they could not do so actively. Right there, they were forced to accept it, and here they actively accepted it. And if you think about your life, maybe there are things that, for a long time you resist, or you don't want to accept, or you feel compelled to accept, and that there's a certain point you feel like, oh, this is like an inextricable part of my life. I might as well actively lay claim to this fact, whatever it is. So we'll see if examples come up. If not, I'll try to think of some myself. I see there are 34 comments in the chat. Oh my God, what am I missing? I'm going to stop the share. See all your wonderful faces. And I just want to say radical acceptance. Yes, David Sigmund. Just one thing that occurred to me that I meant to say in the introduction, like if you think about all the ideological wars around COVID, which I do not want to get into specifically. I mean, I don't want this to be a debate about that, certainly. There's a sense of freedom is obligation or obligation is slavery. Which one, how is obligation expressed? And, so many conversations that we have kind of, might pivot on that axis of what is obligation and how do we understand obligation. Okay, so I see a bunch of hands. I'm going to call my friend Richard first because I don't usually hear him in open book. And then we're going to go to Alana and Jay.
Good morning. Shabbat shalom.
Ben Pearlstein's here, Wendy Miles is here, Elliot Figman is here, and Jessica Litwack is here. And when I figure out the hybrid technology, you will see them as well. But not today, unfortunately. Okay, Richard.
I wanted to point out what, for me, is a difference between an obligation and being compelled to do something. When I think of an obligation, and actually when you were talking, I looked up the root of the word obligation, and it's
Nice.
bound legally. Whereas compulsion, to be compelled, is to be pulled, to be driven to do something, which to me is comes from volition or my heart or my soul versus legally having to do it. So I wanted to bring that up.
Interesting.
That's
Right.
it.
Yeah, no, I'm just processing what you're saying. So, but sometimes even what I'm not obligated to do by the law, I feel compelled to do.
Right. And I think that's coming from within.
Exactly. It can be
As opposed to coming.
from within. It could be, right, when there's not an overlay of external sort of demands and maybe restrictive and repressive demands. It could come from within, absolutely. And it really relates to what we talked about last week is the call, right? We talked about the call, the small aleph in Vayikra. And how do we hear the call? Demand, command, invitation? Okay. So, Alana, Jay, Ronnie.
Hi, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
I wanted to build on what Richard was saying and that question, kind of going back to the first or second text, I guess, about who's obligated to go to the temple.
Yeah.
And wondering, I was thinking about this week of just sort of in traditional Judaism, that idea that women have a different obligation to uphold or different mitzvot to kind of enact, and why that might be. And like having a more feminist reading of that, or what does that mean if you like, I just think that thing of like, what is humanly commanded, what is what you're called to as a human, what you're called to from a rule or from something external versus internal, and perhaps with the categories of people that aren't obliged to attend, is there something where women, perhaps as people who bear or have the possibility of creating or holding life within them into the world, and people who have different experiences than the majority, perhaps people who are blind or whatever, have something internal that's different? I mean, it feels hard because then it elevates in this opposite way, like women over men or people with different abilities in the world over others. But I think there's something to that of having a different or minority or marginalized experience that perhaps connects you more, maybe in the same way that a slave that's not yet freed has maybe an internal desire for freedom and doesn't need to enact freedom by going to the temple. I don't know. I'm struggling with that because
I hear you.
Right,
I have two responses to that. One, strong. But now I'm going to put that aside and respond differently. So, it's interesting because like studying this text or these texts or texts like them in rabbinical school, I was like always infuriated. Women are lined up with slaves and, everybody on that list is insulted to me by the lack of status on one hand. On the other hand, I think what you're saying is so beautiful. And I think it's really a contemporary sort of turning around and saying like, what is the experience of those on the margins? And let's bring them into the center. So I think that's beautiful and powerful. And I recently had an experience in an Orthodox synagogue for my mother's preceding a services, Shacharit, preceding my mother's unveiling, the unveiling of my mother's stone. And, the men were far away, the women were behind a mechitza. None of us, including me, because I couldn't really set myself apart, or I didn't want to set myself apart from my family in that way. We're wearing talit or tefillin or anything. And, I had this image of like, wow, they're literally bound in tefillin. Like they're literally like bound and constricted and praying from a book. And here we are, the conversation's like flowing and wild. And I felt like it was like a different form of worship of God. And my third response is I'm afraid of that being apologetics. Because I actually posted that image on Facebook, and a wonderful like Chabad woman said, oh yeah, that's how the Kabbalah sees women and men, constrained and not constrained. I was like, and then women are raised up in weird ways and romanticized. So we could talk about this for a long time, but I thank you for that like sort of beautiful and kind of potentially redemptive reversal. Okay, I'm going to Jay. That was a lot.
I think I'm going to go in a bit of a different direction, but I think the transition is maybe Rabbi Sharon's comment just now about the obligations that come from God, so to speak. We don't have time to do a deep dive into translation, but it seems to me, and maybe I'm missing something, a connotation that's there in the biblical Hebrew, but especially in terms of the book of Esther, the words in English, commanded, obligations, etc., seem much softer in the original Hebrew. So for example, in 25, when Esther came before the king, he commanded, but the Hebrew is Lifnei HaMelech Amar, the king said.
Nice, beautiful.
So then the question, which relates to your first points, I think early, is are there utterances simply by virtue of position that inherently are obligations or commandments? Does it come with the position? Which of course then raises the interesting question, why does God have to explicitly command?
Okay, so wait, first I want to say something, your question is really interesting, but I want to say something else and then I'm going to try to answer your question a little bit. So what happens in the book of Esther is fascinating because the commands are actually issued from people to people. So Mordecai commands Esther in the first few chapters of the book. And then the fourth chapter, Mordecai turns around and does everything that Esther commanded him. So that's where commands are flowing back and forth. So that's not necessarily about position there, more about situation. However, I think what you're saying is true. It's like, what is the person's, at times, what is the person's positionality? You know, if someone's boss says something, it becomes a command, right? You are to do that. It becomes a command because you have that job and you're sort of in a contractual relationship. But then the last thing you said is about God. So say that part again.
So, okay, if you accept that Amar by a king, the consequences is a commandment, even if the word is not used. Then the question is, why does God have to use that explicit word, has to explicitly command?
That's a great question. I think the rest of the session will answer that.
Great.
We need more text.
And I'm not a shill either. That's really came from me. So
no, that was great.
Can I offer something?
Yeah. Okay.
Was that Jay?
Yeah.
Should I
Ben
come over?
Pearlstein would like to say something.
who I knew as an infant.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Rabbi Ben Pearlstein. My apologies.
I still knew him as an infant.
He knew me when I was like.
Yeah, but now
Just
he has
one.
position. Listen to what he has to say.
So Jay, I wanted to just say it's interesting. What you said was so powerful because I'm just thinking about the way the Torah formulates just this idea of mitzvah in general. It's usually that God speaks to Moses and tells Moses, did this already come up? And tells Moshe is the one who's supposed to command, the human being. On the human level, we need this sense of there needs to be some kind of, I don't know, logic that ties us together that isn't obvious, that isn't taken for granted, but God actually issues these commands in exactly the way you suggested, as just a speaker.
Is that true throughout the Torah?
Well, I'm thinking it's obviously there's some complexity because we have tzav this week,
Right,
then we have titzaveh.
Right.
We have these different verb forms.
And we have mitzvot that are God's. So that makes things a little more complicated.
For sure. But I wanted to lift up this idea that at least between God and Moses, there's a relationship just of speaking.
And certainly there is this week
Yeah.
in terms of the beginning of the parsha. Okay, now Elliot.
Hello, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. So I just wanted to bring something in from Hasidic Masters class this last week. And Rabbi David mentioned that in Aramaic, Tzav means connect.
We're getting there.
We're coming to that.
We're going there.
The last page.
I'm sorry.
Page 7, Elliot.
Oh my God, we have so much to do. Okay, I'm going to ask everybody to be really quick. Oh, I want to get a timer actually, but I don't have one today. You have a timer. Oh no, I don't mean a phone timer. I meant like a literal sand. It's okay. All right, Ronnie, Alana, Marga, Nehemiah, and Roberta. Okay, and no more hands for now. Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I want to pick up again on what Alana said. I found that first passage extremely troubling. because obviously it's an equal opportunity offender for our contemporary sensibilities. And if
You got everything there, right? Disability, gender, right? The whole thing.
if we're all made in the
Yes,
image
yeah.
of God, if we're all in the B'Tselem Elohim, how can anybody be excluded? On the other hand, all the rituals of Judaism seem to be about making a difference between this and that. And all of the sacrifices have to be from perfect animals. The first fruits that we bring have to be perfect. So God demands some kind of perfection in these rituals, and yet leaving out so many of us is very problematic, I think. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you. I'm going to resist the impulse to respond and say important point. Thank you. Alana.
So at the risk of sounding apologetic, I want to offer another view. I'm looking at the difference between a kind of developmental maturation view of the command, in the way that a parent will tell a child and instruct forcefully a child, and then the ability to make a choice and to step forward with the call, and the degree to which, so thinking about the degree to which we were all at Mount Sinai and we all received the Torah, then that inner call is part of what we've also received, and that is ours to draw from. And just thirdly, I just wanted to reference this different kind of call that we hear from Rivka, who says, Elech, I will go.
Mm-hmm.
And the ways in which that sort of Elech energy is kind of embedded, is seated in us, and could be seen as a more mature elaboration of hearing and creating and responding and embodying the call.
Beautiful, beautiful, Alana. I also would say Deuteronomy, especially Deuteronomy 30, has like a beautiful passage about the word becoming very close to us and intimate, and really kind of a democratized understanding of like Torah and mitzvah, which I'm sure we will look at in some open book down the line. Thank you, Alana. Okay, Miriam Margot.
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button for a minute.
Okay, just one thing, Margot. Okay, on the line is just Nehemiah and Roberta. Rachel, I'm not taking any more hands now. Hopefully I'll get to you at the end.
Okay, I just wanted to, I'm going to try to make it quick and to the point. I was struck by the difference between the mountain being held over in the position of mitzvah as compared to the Mishkan, where anybody could offer this portable sanctuary. So you have Sinai, which is in one place, and the Mishkan, which is portable, whose heart moved them, nidvenu libo. So the mitzvah compels. It's like you can do no other. The universe demands this. You have only 2 degrees of freedom to do that or to do something else. But the Mishkan can go in many different directions. Women are included. They do the weaving, they bring lots of offerings, and perhaps women and other people who are differently abled have more degrees of freedom because there are other ways to draw close. But for able-bodied folks, for men, maybe they just have these 2 degrees of freedom. And finally, the connection to Nidvenu Libo and having only 2 degrees of freedom. Nidvenu is the same root as Nadav. It's generosity, but we're going to find out about Nadav's straying from those 2 degrees of freedom in next week's Parashat Shemini.
Next episode, we will see the drama of Nadav and Avihu. Stay tuned. Thank you, Margot. That was a beautiful sort of address of so many points. Okay, Nehemiah, and then Roberta, and then we're moving to some more text because we really have to get to some of these other ideas about mitzvah.
Shabbat Shalom, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Wonderful. I follow on things that people said before me so beautifully. the inner compelling that minority people who are in tune in can hear. That was one of my Bibles, the Gospel of Jesus to the Ephesians, contain what the Gnostic claim to be the first version of the Ten Commandments, which much more are inner. And one of them, I am the Lord, your law, the invisible law, and you should make laws. And then it's claimed that because people couldn't take the inner, it was too high for them, Moses broke it and brought another one, and then 10, and then 618, that we need a lot of mitzvahs because we can't hear the inner invisible Lord inside us.
Interesting.
So we are a teaching which is full of duality because we are not able to hear the unity.
Interesting. Thank you, Nechemia. I don't actually think that external is less than internal necessarily, but that's a whole conversation. So I'm going to go to Roberta. I mean, lesser than internal. Yes, Roberta.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. The whole stream of how we're looking at the Megillah and how it fits with the Parshat Tzav just really underscores for me how much the Megillah is about internal transformation, and it's helping me understand why God is hidden, and or even hidden, disguised as King Ahasuerus. Right, like this well, that's a major theme in Chassidut, what I understood from a Purim thing I attended.
No, I know, but it's such a radical and sort of shocking idea.
Well, I was at this whole teaching yesterday from Jerusalem that the whole thing is about the hiddenness of God, because and Esther's inner transformation, right, which she is like this whole systematic how she prepares and all that, is so she can enter the Holy of Holies. And of course that is an inner transformation, and that's what is coming through so clearly, and this whole dance, right, between, what is the obligation, what is the source. Like, what does Torah really want? Where does Torah want us to source our observance?
Okay, I love that question. I'm going to stick with that. Let everybody hear that question, and we're going to look at the rest of the text. Thank you, Roberta. Okay, share the screen. Okay, so this is interesting. I'm just going to briefly reference it. Sorry. So here in this Mishnah, it's in this Gemara, it says that one who is commanded is and does a mitzvah is greater than one who is not commanded and performs that mitzvah. So just take that in. I'm not going to say a lot about it right now. It's provocative and sort of complicates our conversation. Okay, so the next text is from Shai Held, and it sort of helps us understand. People in person and on the screen are going like this. Help us understand this trajectory from slavery to freedom. If someone can read that, can I have a reader? Is anyone?
4:5, I'm sorry.
We're in source 10. Is anyone raising their hand?
Miriam had.
Yes.
Great.
Her hand raised.
Mute and read in a loud voice. Thank you.
It is critical to emphasize that the journey the Israelites take from one building project to another transforms them from slaves of an earthly ruler to servants of a heavenly one. I love Shai Held. Freedom, as imagined by the book of Exodus, is decidedly not about casting off the burdens of service altogether. In fact, it says a great deal about our secularized society and its often impoverished conceptions of freedom, that while we often cite the demand that Pharaoh let my people go, we omit the telos of that call, that they serve me.
That they may serve me.
That they may serve me. Perhaps we should make the point differently. The Torah is passionately concerned with a journey from slavery to freedom. That's interesting that it's hyphenated, but it imagines freedom in ways that are different from, and one is tempted to say antithetical to, the ways freedom is commonly spoken of in contemporary terms. In capitalist, consumerist America, doing whatever I want, whenever I want, is arguably not freedom at all, but enslavement to impulse. The depths of freedom are discovered not in self-assertion, but in rare moments of authentic self-transcendence. Authentic freedom, Jewish theology insists, is found in service to something and someone, should be capital O, greater than oneself.
Beautiful. I love the reading. And I want to say a couple of things about this. One is, so in Exodus, we go from being an Eved LePharaoh, a slave of Pharaoh, to an Eved LaHashem, a servant of God. And the words are the same, but we translate them differently. So that's interesting. And it reminds me so much of, hold on, Bob Dylan's song, right? You got to serve somebody. You know, you may be a preacher, you may be a city councilman, maybe working in a barbershop, you may be somebody's mistress, but you're going to have to, like, no matter who you are, like there's something, and I believe this, and I feel it, there's something underlying, like the nature of human existence, which means you're fundamentally serving, right? It may be, again, it may be a pharaoh, and it may be God, it may be human beings, like, you know, we each have to figure out who we're serving, and I guess what we're worshiping. But I want to say something else about Shai's, this one, and I also love Shai, but there's this one point where I don't entirely agree. I don't think that America's understanding of freedom can simply be boiled down to these negative things, you know, capitalist, consumerist. But, you know, America's notion of freedom was born in a moment of, you know, throwing off the shackles of tyranny. And that's so important right now. So I just want to make that a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, I also.
Here's Rabbi Ingber.
Hi, everybody. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I didn't realize I'm the tech piece of this dynamic duo. I'll be here. I'll be here next time to make sure that I will. I really will. I'm going inside the daven, but I just came in for this piece, and I think that when I hear Shai speaking, I think that often we have a bogeyman. You know, the liberal Jewish community suffers deeply from if the Orthodox world suffers from a kind of sometimes an obedience that is blind, or, you know, whatever, that's also a caricature. But if there's obedience is a much more palatable and natural in the Orthodox world where I grew up, you know, liberal Jewish world has a bit of the other problem, as those who live in the liberal Jewish world know. And I think that Shai is setting up a bit of he's absolutely spot on, as you said. Like we often forget that there's avdut, it's the same word, but I think that he elides over the majority of human history where that obligation was taken for granted and was manipulated and used in ways that were really ugly. And so the kind of revolt against obligation and kind of the tyranny of choice was a healthy abreaction. It was a reaction to and like, as you said, like letting go of the shackles of a kind of tyranny of religious obligation or any obligation to the other, which is like, you know, the authority figure. And now I think what his piece is obviously a response to, you know, a corrective. Like we're forgetting this whole other piece of the Torah, which is what you're pointing out. And I think that is a healthy reminder that we can become enslaved even to choice, and choice itself becomes its own. You know, no self-transcendence can happen when all you do is all you're beholden to is your own impulses. I think that's a brilliant,
for sure.
You know, that enslaved to our impulses. Anyway, this is an exciting conversation. So other people, todah for that. Shabbat shalom. Wow, we're obligated to go inside and leave. We're gonna go.
Jessica, I see your hand. I'm going to do a couple more texts on calling you. Is that?
That's okay.
Was it really right on point right now?
It was about this, but I just
okay, quick.
No, it was about America and
oh, okay.
Point. So I have something to say, but I can say it to.
Jessica, we want to hear from you. Just hold on for 5 minutes, okay? Don't say it to Elliot. Hold on. The other thing I want to say about this is that this screams also to me about this moment between Ukraine and Russia. I mean, it's, it's about freedom. It's about so many things, but it's about freedom. Okay, so I love Levinas, and I love this idea about being commanded. And he says, so Levinas, French Jewish 20th century philosopher, the epiphany of the absolutely other is a face by which the other challenges and commands me through their nakedness, through their destitution. She challenges me from her humility and from their height. The absolutely other is the human other, and the putting into question of the same by the other is a summons to respond. Hence, to be I signifies not being able to escape this responsibility. So to me, this is a reframing of remembering we were a stranger in a strange land, and the command to thereby love the stranger and care for the stranger, right? It's like it's grounded, command then is grounded in our own vulnerability, right? The vulnerability of the other, the nakedness, the destitution, commands me. I am obligated to respond, right? There's something about that vulnerability and that need from which I am simply not free. And I know that when I pass by a homeless person on the street, and either I give or I don't, but in either case, it registers. Like I'm not free from that need. I feel that need. And when I walk by it, it's there's an attendant either guilt or discomfort, something, right? I'm just not entirely free from just that call. Okay, so just looking at the time. Okay, so a couple of things. Let me just think what we're going to do now. Oh, this is just too beautiful to pass up. Do this and Safta, because I said I would. And then hear from Rachel and Jessica and anyone else who wants to say something. Okay, so this is in Bamidbar Rabbah. And it says here it's responding to so that you'll remember and do all my mitzvot. So they're talking about, I'm guessing, is the fringes we wear on the talit. This is comparable to one who was thrown into the sea. The captain extended a rope to him and said, "Catch this rope in your hand and don't let it go. For if you let it go, you will have no life." Even so, the Holy One, blessed be she, said to Israel, "The whole time that you cleave to the mitzvot, and you who cleave to Hashem, your God, you are all living today." And similarly, it says, "Hold tight to tradition, Musar, don't let it alone. Keep it safe, for it is your life." So every mitzvah is a rope thrown to the drowning, right? What an amazing image, right? Every mitzvah is a lifeline. Every mitzvah is whether it's ritual or ethical in terms of between people or between us and God, it's a way to say, we're not solipsistically imprisoned on ourselves, and there's a way to meaning, to purpose, to respond to the call. Right, so you could think about the 613 mitzvot as 613 opportunities, to connect, and maybe here even to be saved. Okay, so let me just go to the tzavta thing. Hold on. Okay, so this is the Chernobyl rabbi, the Mourner 18th century rabbi, Hasidic master. The rabbis of the Talmud said, the reward for a mitzvah is a mitzvah. That is to say that God gave us commandments so that we may thereby cleave to God, right? Because the Aramaic understanding of mitzvah is related to the word savta, which means to join together. That's the reward for a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that is savta, joined together, for by means of performing a mitzvah, one cleaves with God, and there is no Savta, right? Like my grandmother. There's no greater reward than that. Okay, I'm going to read one more, and then I'm going to open things up. So this is from the commentary, the Arbat Turim, on the classical work of the Shulchan Aruch. The term mitzvah can connote relationship as in savta and connection, because through each mitzvah of the Torah, one connects, ties, and forms bonds between the light of the divine glow to the consciousness. In this way, one becomes tied to God. And I do want to respond a little bit to what people were saying about the inner call versus the outer call. So there is clearly, like literally, a trajectory in the Torah of God, sort of being full on and full in the beginning, and, real sort of big presentation of God, and often scary presentation of God, that kind of recedes over time, and God giving more room to God's people or God's children kind of grow up. And it reaches, one could say, its apex in the book of Esther, where it's human beings who are commanding and human beings who are decreeing, and people who are freely taking upon themselves obligations. So there definitely is that sort of trajectory there. And yet, at least for me, and I'm curious to hear what you all have to say, obligation is not only an inner thing. Every person that I'm in contact with, my family, my children, my friends, every person issues some kind of obligation that I experience, but it's not only an inner experience, it's coming from without. So again, complicated, and I know I can probably nuance that in 100 ways, but I won't right now. And I know Rachel was waiting, and then Jessica here in person, and then I'll call on Sharon, Marilyn, Helio, and then probably we have to end. Okay, Rachel Macliff, are you still with us? Oh, there you are.
Oh, yeah. Two things. Doesn't God speak in the imperative? Here, he, come, go, do this, don't. Grammatically, God does a lot of commanding.
Okay, so sure, God commands all over the place in the Torah. Absolutely. Not in the book of Esther, God is not commanding. And also remember, and I often say this, that the Torah is just the beginning of the conversation about God and everything else, not the end, right? The Talmud has a whole different presentation and understanding of God, the rabbis, than the Torah does. But so Rachel, so when you say, doesn't God command, so what are you saying by that?
I wouldn't read too much into it. It was just silly because this is Talmudic thinking, but I find this kind of funny that we're worried about whether God is commanding or not commanding. If he says, honor thy father and thy mother, he's doing
We're not worried about whether God is commanding or not commanding. What we're worried about in this session is how we understand and relate to command. That's what we're worrying about. At least that's what I'm worrying about. That's the question I'm raising.
I say that a little slow, to really understand
our approach to mitzvah and our understanding of
mitzvah. Okay.
Yeah, no doubt that God issues commands in the Torah. Okay, I'm going to go on to Jessica in this room, and then Sharon, Marilyn, and Helio.
I'm going back to Shai-Held, so I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
It's not, so I feel like I think one of the mitzvot that I really respond to is truth. Not reality, but truth. Like, what is the truth for me? Is digging in and finding what the truth of a commandment is. And I feel like what Shai is talking about, and also I just want to say that, one of the lyrics, the lines in the Dylan song is, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord. So there's plenty of people.
It may be Pharaoh or it may be God.
Or it may be Putin, yeah.
Right, but you're serving somebody. Exactly.
And so to be honest about who you're serving, to yourself, truthful. And I think the thing about this, I was, as part of the subcommittee of Romemu's justice reform, criminal justice reform, I went to a Jewish coalition yesterday and we were talking about freedom here. And it was about, freedom is a privilege to some, so we may feel free in America, but not all of us are free in America. And also, what is the freedom based on? Looking at just peace, justice and peace, justice and freedom. So this country was created on, with the enslavement of one people and the genocide of a whole other people. And I think that our lack of teaching our children that and acknowledging it truthfully has been a problem for this country to be truly free, because we have to acknowledge where we came from.
Thank you,
That's why
Jessica.
we acknowledge the land we're on right
Thank you.
now, which is Lenape land.
Lenape land. So I think that's an essential question, and I'm so happy you brought it up and sort of expanded, these notions of freedom. But who's free, and what did freedom cost